Everyone, this is Jennifer Mondino with the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund at the National Women's Law Center. We are going to allow folks just a couple of minutes to sign on, and then we will get started with our webinar on the intersections of disability, discrimination, and sex harassment. So stay tuned. We will officially get started in just a few moments. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part of our webinar series on the intersections of disability, discrimination, and sex harassment. This is Jennifer Mondino with the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund at the National Women's Law Center. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to all of the attorneys in our Legal Network for Gender Equity. We are very, very grateful for your time and all of the work that you do to help us connect people to legal services and access justice. Thank you also to our fabulous panel of presenters today, Dara Baldwin, Julia Bascom, and Michal Shinar. And thank you also to my colleagues at the National Women's Law Center, in particular, my team members, Nicole Fout and Marifed Zacarias, for supporting this webinar series and all of the work to make today's presentation possible. So the topic for today, this is the second part of a two-part webinar series on the intersections of disability, discrimination, and sex harassment. We had the first part of the webinar series last Tuesday, and folks that missed it can find a recording of that webinar on the National Women's Law Center website. Today, we're going to build off of the discussion from last week and focus on guidance for attorneys interested in bringing legal claims on behalf of individuals who are facing both sex harassment and discrimination on the basis of disability. Last week, we did sort of an introduction to these issues and how they might present. So I'm going to do a very brief introduction of our fantastic presenters. You can later read much more about them online, but I want to give most of the airtime to them. First of all, I'm introducing these folks in alphabetical order by their last names. It's very difficult to decide how to begin otherwise. Dara Baldwin is currently the Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights, or CDR. CDR is a nonprofit community-based advocacy and service organization for people with all types of disabilities. She has been working in the social justice line of work since 2004 and has particular expertise in national and international advocacy for the civil and human rights of persons with disabilities. Julia Bascom serves as Executive Director at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, which is a national disability rights organization run by and for autistic people and self-advocates with other developmental disabilities. In addition to her role with ASEN, Julia currently serves on the Disability Equality Index Advisory Board, the Centennial National Disability Advisory Council, the Advisory Board of Felicity House, and the boards of the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities, Allies for Independence, and the Alliance for Citizen-Directed Supports. Last but not least, Mihal Shinar is a senior associate at Gilbert Employment Law, a law firm based in Silver Spring, Maryland. She represents employees in all aspects of employment law, including discrimination complaints, disability accommodations, and wage and hour disputes. She is a frequent presenter on disability law and sex discrimination topics, including for the Tenbrook Disability Law Symposium and the Metropolitan Washington Employment Lawyers Association. So there you have a bit about our presenters. What we're going to do is have individual presentations by Dara, Julia, and Mihal, and then we're going to have time for questions at the end. So if folks have questions, please send those questions to us through the chat function that you'll see on the screen. We will be able to see those questions, and I can ask them to our presenters after they've finished their presentations. Just a few quick housekeeping notes. Please turn the sound off on your screen. We're not going to be taking questions or comments during the presentations. And if you have questions about any of the logistics or other questions for our presenters, you can send all of those questions to us through the chat function on the screen. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dara.
Hi, thank you everyone. Good afternoon or good morning wherever you are in the country. I want to say thank you again to the National Women's Law Center and Time's Up Legal Network in reference to doing this wonderful webinar series and conversations. So I'm going to talk to you about diversity and disability and kind of in the disability community, then do kind of a brief overview of the ADA and some other disability laws, and then talk about sensitivity, disability sensitivity, and working with clients with disabilities. So again, my name is Dara Baldwin. I'm the Director of National Policy at the Center for Disability Rights. That is a Center for Independent Living, and we work on cross disability. So I work in the area of people with disabilities, all disabilities, blind, low vision, deaf, hard of hearing. And if you have your slides in front of you, you want to go to the next slide. Or it should say inclusion, justice. It's kind of a montage of different things. There you go. I just wanted people to see how we do our work and what we mean in social justice and collective liberation work, and that we want to be, if nothing else, inclusive of all people. And then the next slide. I also work in all of these different areas and with these different terminologies and conversations. And I want you to have this in your mind as I'm speaking to you about the disability community. So the next slide, please. So in the disability rights movement, we do have some serious concerns and issues. We have a hashtag, disability2white, TOOWHITE, because we have a lot of people in this community who do not represent the people who are out in the world in the country. And that doesn't mean that there are people who are not working on this, but it is a concern for us. And so a bunch of us got together, people of color, people of what we call multi-marginalized, which means you could be, you know, imagine an African-American woman who is Muslim, formerly incarcerated, and a refugee with a disability. Those are multi-marginalizations that are discriminations towards that person. So we created what's called Keep Calm and Lead On. And if you go, you can click on this and go to our website. And that's what it is a group of us who got together to have this conversation around what does it mean to be multi-marginalized in the disability community and working in disability rights. So if you go to the next slide. Also, disability rights history is absolutely fascinating, but that too also lacks diversity. There are a couple of books you can read. I'll put out there, No Pity by Joe Shapiro, who is a internationally known and mostly national known syndicated reporter with NPR. His book, No Pity, really talks about the disability rights movement, but even he and I have had this conversation. He mentions no people of color in that movement as if none of them had anything to do with the disability rights movement or the passage of the ADA, such as they'll talk about congressional leaders, but they will not talk about the fact that Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, who was on Ed and Labor, who Barbara Jordan actually had a disability from Texas, to help get the ADA out of that committee. The ADA was in 8 committees. And so they are completely left out of the conversation, as well as our Native American community. So there are a bunch of us who've been writing books, and they should be coming out soon, and we can get those out to you. But there's also some analogs around where race and where people of multi-marginalization were in the disability rights. Also, you will see we have the Lead On Network and then the NDLA statement on racism and bias. And NDLA is the National Disability Leadership Alliance, which is a group run by and for people with disabilities, and all the organizations in there, which ASAN is a member, that's where Julia, who's going to speak, is. Those organizations usually have a president, CEO, who's a person with a disability. Their board is 51% made up of people with disabilities. Their staff is about 51% or more, and they have national outreach and advocacy. So that's NDLA's kind of criteria to be a part of that. I'm a part of NDLA through NICL, the National Council of Independent Living, where my organization, CDR, is a member, and my executive director, Bruce Darling, is the president of NICL. So we're all kind of intertwined here and know each other. Also in disability rights, there's kind of 3 avenues of how people do this work. You have one is paternalism, woe is we, and we have to take care of them. This still exists and is still around, unfortunately. We actually have a group, a couple of them, who still use terminology that we don't use, like VOR, a word we don't use anymore. And that's basically how they do their work, around how we have to take care of them, and woe is we. Then we have clinical, where we have this whole cure and fix them, which we also don't believe in, that we don't believe there's anything wrong with people having a disability. If you don't leave here with anything else, please leave this conversation with the fact that there's nothing wrong with having a disability. And I'll talk about that a little later. And then the third way is civil and human rights. And we believe, and that's how we work, mostly ASAN and all of us at NDLA, that people with disabilities, no matter what their disability is, can and should live in the community, and they should have the opportunities to decent employment, housing, and all other aspects of life. You want to go to the next slide? So this next slide is about intersectionality, and that is how I go at my work, and so does CDR and NICL. We've taken this on, and some other disability rights organizations, and saying that we're going to do what's called equity activism, which means we include the full person. And again, back to my example of the African-American woman who had multi-marginalization. And the term and the work around intersectionality comes from Kimberly Crenshaw, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a critical race theorist, and she works at 2 universities as a law professor, UCLA and Columbia. And she's also started the Center on Intersectionality and Social Welfare, as well as the African American Policy Forum. And you can look her up, and there's some information there for you to read about intersectionality and how we use it in disability rights. So the next slide. So disability rights laws, people think, oh, the ADA, it just came about. That's not true. So first you had the Architectural Barrier Act, which went the doors and the ramps, and said, okay, you know, this person has to get in. And I use this example when I'm out university. So the student could get into the room, but the professor could still say, no, I don't want to teach you, and you have to leave. Why? Because there was no civil rights. So then they came and did the Rehab Act of 1974. Section 504 said any entity receiving federal funds now had to provide civil rights to that person. So that student now can get in the classroom, and there's not a university in the country that doesn't receive federal funds through some way, research. They got a road going through their thing. They have FAFSA. They got something going on. Once they took that money, they had to follow Rehab Act Section 504. So now the professor has to teach the student. But now the student, hopefully, is being what's called community integrated and going out to lunch with his or her or the families, the other students, and the local subway is not accessible. And the owner says, nope, and you can't come in here, and I'm not going to make it accessible, and I'm not going to serve, I'm not going to bring food out to you. And that local subway owner did not have to do that. Why? Because they were not receiving federal funds. Unless they were a subway on the campus, that's a different story, but on the regular street or something. Then you also have the Air Carrier Access Act of 1986. It literally is 1 page long if you want to get it. Senator Dole did it. PVA, Paralyzed Veterans of America, he did it for them. That covers from when you're on a plane, the gate through the plane. And that says that all of that area is supposed to be accessible. If you've flown in the past 5 months, 5 days, you will know that is not true. We continue to work on that. There is also no private right of action in the Air Carrier Access Act, so people cannot sue. We're working to try to change that and the reauthorization of that now. Next slide, please. So next we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came in 1990. And what that did was close up all of those things I just talked about. So now the student can go into the classroom, can be taught by the professor, and that subway place has to be accessible to them to eat. And so those are the things around the ADA. It has 5 titles. You're going to hear about the laws later from our other presenters, but I just wanted you to know this. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 didn't include disabilities or protected, as a protected class. The ADA made it a protected class. The premise of the ADA, yes, we want doors and ramps to be accessible, but the premise of it is community integration. It is the inclusion of people with disabilities in every aspect of life. And I'm going to go back to what I said before about nothing wrong with having a disability. People look at me when I do my presentations and trainings and they say, you can't possibly believe that. And I must tell you, as a Black woman, yes, I do, because my grandfather, my mother's father, was told he can only have an 8th grade education in Alabama. Then he moved away and went to Newark, New Jersey. He put not only himself through school, but his 6 brothers and sisters who became judges and lawyers and doctors and accountants, his children through school who also did the same thing, and his grandchildren through school. And so when you tell me there's something wrong with someone, they told Black people there was something wrong with us for so long, and we had a Black man be president of the United States. So therefore, I don't believe those things when you say that to me. And so I don't believe there's anything wrong with people with disabilities, and I want you to come away from that and from this conversation. Next slide, please. So there's 5 titles. The Title I is employment, where most of the work will be done that you would do on, but Title II and Title III are also areas you might want to look at when you're doing cases, and as I said before, this will be discussed later. But you do have the ADA National Network there. That is free. That is through the Department of Health and Human Services. It used to be through DOJ. We got it moved to DHHS, which we're happy. And they have regional resource centers around the country, so you'll have one in your region. There's an 800 number. When you call if you need help, it goes to that region where you're in. They also do free webinars and conversations around the ADA. They do have conferences that are a minimal charge to go to and attend. You can also present at those webinars and also at those conferences if you wish, once you get acclimated in doing disability work. And then also they have what's called an ABC kind of building block where you can learn the ADA, you learn Title I, you read about it, and then you take the test. It's free, and it's a module that's open. You can start in January and end it in September. We make all of our advocates at Nickel who are on the ADA Civil Rights Task Force take it, because how can you fight for your rights if you don't know your rights? We as leaders must take the test every other year because things change and are updated. Next slide, please. Finally, I'm going to talk to you about what to say and how to talk around people with disabilities. So, just like any other group, you're going to have to learn it. You have to have conversations with people. This chart is here. I helped work on this chart. We did some surveys with people. We put this together in 2011. I can't believe it's been that long. And even right now, that has changed. But most of the stuff on not to say has not changed. Like using the word handicap, I tell people in my training, that ended in 1980 with NCD, the National Council of Disability. Only time you use the word handicap is when you're asking somebody about their golf score. What is your handicap? That's about it. Otherwise, don't use that word. We use accessible parking, accessible bathroom. So those are the words you use there. We don't use the word impaired because that implies that something is wrong with somebody, and they are not. We say there's nothing wrong, so we use blind, low vision. Mental health and ill, the bottom one, crazy, and using the word crazy. We also have a statement, and we can send it out from BASMA, and a bunch of us worked on it, and Julia's here, we worked on that, to stop calling the President of the United States crazy. He has not been identified, nor no clinician has said he is that, and when you use those terms, our people with mental health diagnoses are not going for help. and are going back into seclusion because they are equated to this man. Call him what he is, or call him what you think he is. Don't call him those things. And when we have media on TV, when they talk about these shooters and that, stop using these terms. You don't know if that person had a mental health diagnosis, and most of the time they did not. So we really want people to stop using those terms, and if you're going to work with people who are coming to you with issues and concerns around their rights, then those terms should not be used. I'm going to go back to the top one, persons with a disability. We do have what's called people's first language, but that has even changed, and my good friend here, Julia's here, she's one of the people pushing this forward. Some people still will use the term disabled. I'm disabled, or the disabled folks, and that's fine. When we first started doing this in 2009 and stuff, disabled was not empowered. Disabled meant a disabled car on the highway or a disabled copier machine. But just like in all communities, this community has empowered the word disabled. And so now it is not thought as a term of, negating or horrible. And so disabled has been empowered, and language has changed. Just like me as an African American. We started as Negro, then we went to Black American, then we went to African American. But at the same time, also, you respect the people. So talk to the person, ask them what they like or what's going on. When you're writing something, for me, I have to use first-person language if I'm writing brief, because that's what's out there and that's what's accepted. It's just like if I'm writing any other research paper, I use the terms African American. But when I'm speaking to the public and when I'm speaking to my friends, I don't consider myself an African American woman. I am a Black woman. But that is in my conversation. That is not in my writing and what I'm doing. So those are the areas in which I would put that forward and speak to other people about how you should use people first language or using the term disabled. The other slides are resources that I hope are helpful for you. There are links there to the Lead On Network, to No Pity, all the things I was talking about. The 60-minute segment there on Ed Roberts will give you an introduction into independent living and that whole concept of what we believe in. Please look at that so you know how people with disabilities feel about independent living. And then the next slide, same thing, ADA training, our history. Next slide. Mass collaboration. I just believe the only way we are all going to overcome any of these things is to collaborate together. And so I hope and look forward to collaborating with many of you out there in the world doing this work. And I'm going to turn it over to my next person, or turn it back to the moderator.
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
Fantastic presentation,
and thank you.
Now we are going to turn it over to Julia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Like it says on the slide, my name is Julia Bascom. I'm the Executive Director of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN, which is shorter to say. We've got our website up there, autisticadvocacy.org, if you want to know more about what we do. Really, the thing to know is that we're a disability rights organization that's run by and for autistic adults. So I'm autistic, my staff is, my board is, etc. And people with other sort of similar developmental disabilities. We also do a lot of cross-disability work. But I'm going to be talking today specifically about things you might see when you're serving clients with developmental disabilities, and just some background on that and accommodation strategies you can use. So for the questions, I am not a lawyer, so I'm happy to answer practical questions, but I'll defer the litigation to the litigators in the room. Moving on to the next slide. So I'm going to take us through some alphabet soup pretty quickly. One of the frustrating things about developmental disability is that a lot of different terms get used to mean slightly different things. So an intellectual disability is a cognitive disability that someone, gets early in life when they're born or early on, and it results in a lower IQ and impairments in adaptive functioning, and those are like independent living skills, that kind of thing. So these are disabilities like Down syndrome. The terminology for intellectual disability has changed a lot over the years, because of the attitudes that our society has about people with intellectual disabilities. Whatever label we assign pretty quickly becomes a slur. But right now, the accepted term is intellectual disability. Autism is a disability that impacts communication, sensory processing, motor skills, cognition, really everything, and then ultimately social interaction. When we talk about autism as a society, we tend to talk about social interaction, but I cannot emphasize enough how much that is just the tip of the iceberg for the autistic person. It's a consequence of everything else that's different, not the main thing. Most autistic people don't have an intellectual disability, although some of us also do. but we all have impairments in adaptive functioning or independent living skills, and most of us will need some kind of support for our whole life. And then developmental disability can mean so many different things, depending on which law you're talking about and who you're talking to. But in general, and for the purposes of this presentation, it means it's a word that we use to refer to people with intellectual disabilities, autistic people, and people with really closely related disabilities. It's the group of people who get called the R word and who get treated in certain ways by our society because we have disabilities that affect our brain from a very early age. That's the core concept. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so just again to walk you through some acronyms that you 100% do not need to remember, but if you're ever curious, ID means intellectual disability. IDDD is again one of those big umbrella terms, and it means intellectual disability or developmental disability. ASD means autism spectrum disorder. DD is developmental disability. We talked about both of those. And then IDD is another umbrella term that means intellectual or developmental disabilities. Honestly, all those different variants on ID, IDD, DD, and IDD get used interchangeably 95% of the time. So all you need to know when you see those acronyms is that we're talking about people with a broad developmental disability, and then get into the specifics of the actual person you're talking to. You don't need to remember any of this. It's just a reference if you ever happen to want it. Can we go to the next slide? I'm going to get a little more concrete. Okay. So in practical terms, IDD or DD or whatever means that you can expect to see differences in learning and thinking, in sensory processing and communication, in social interaction, in motor skills, and in independent living. But those differences will vary a lot person to person. Most people with DD are going to need support over the course of our lifespan. We might live by ourselves, we might not. But it's important to know that in the disability community, independent living isn't actually necessarily about living by yourself. There's a very famous quote from Judy Heumann that's actually very important when we're thinking about disability rights. And that quote is roughly, independent living does not mean doing things by yourself. It means being in charge of how things get done. In the disability community, needing support and being your own autonomous person are not contradictory. It's really important to understand that even people with very significant disabilities who need help all the time, who need help understanding what's going on around them, who need help communicating, who need help making decisions, are still their own person. They have all the civil and human rights that any other person can have. And in the right situation, they can also be in charge of their lives, and they have a right to be in charge of their lives. That's really what my organization focuses on specifically, how we create those ways, how we make sure that people's rights are being enforced. But it's just a core concept that you need to carry with you. In general, and I'll get to this in a second, but there's a huge range of variation with DD. You shouldn't be thinking about it as like a checklist that you're going to go through. You should think about it as like a switchboard with a lot of different dials and sliders. And everyone's going to be calibrated a little bit differently. So two people with the same label, one of them might talk, one of them might not talk. One of them might be able to read, one of them might not be able to read. One of them might be really, really social, one of them might not really want to talk to you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can't predict based on one characteristic what the person's other characteristics are going to be. You really have to get to know the whole person. And you'll be really surprised once you do get to know the whole person. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So I'm going to talk in a little more detail about a lot of these, like what these differences can actually look like. So social communication differences are often the differences that people run into first. You encounter them first because you're interacting with a person in a social situation. And it can mean a lot of different things. Someone can have differences in nonverbal communication, which might mean that they don't make the same facial expressions, or they don't make facial expressions that you recognize, they don't make eye contact, they have like a tone, like a monotone, or they sound kind of weird. Or they might not be able to read your tone of voice or your facial expressions and so on and so forth. And that can result in a miscues and misunderstanding. It's also really common for this to be inconsistent, for people to be able to like change their tone of voice, change their facial expression, make gestures, but not to be able to do all of those things at the same time. Or maybe they can do it, but they can't read it on other people, or they can read it on other people, but they can't do it for themselves. And the problem with this is that when you encounter someone with that kind of social communication difference, your brain doesn't usually go, oh, wow, they must have a social communication disability. What your brain does is go, oh, they have a really weird vibe. They're kind of odd. I don't like them. I don't trust them. 99% of the time when someone doesn't make eye contact with me, it means they're not trustworthy. So I feel kind of weird about this person. And you often don't even recognize it. So it's going to be really important working with clients to be on the watch for that bias and to think about ways that your comfort level might be changing because of these kinds of differences as opposed to something intrinsic about the person. People might also have trouble like understanding timing in a conversation, so they might seem really shy or they might be interrupting you a lot. Again, that's not always the kind of thing that makes your brain go, oh, this is a disability, and it can really impact how you view someone, so it's something to be mindful of. I'm going to talk about salience a lot, but in general, when people think differently, they might find different things important about a conversation or an interaction, and that can make it a little hard to all get on the same page about what we're talking about, so it's something to keep an eye out for. A lot of people with DD are face blind, which means that we have a hard time recognizing other people. You folks on the phone didn't hear this, but when I came into the room, I warned all these lovely ladies that except for Dara, who I've seen hundreds of times, I will need all of them to remind me who they are the next time I see them because I haven't seen them enough to match the face to the name. I've learned to do that because I know that when you don't warn people ahead of time, people can get really offended. But it's something that you're probably going to encounter quite a bit working with women with disabilities, and it can also complicate reporting and describing harassment if you don't remember what that person looks like. So it's something to keep an eye out for. I'm going to try to go quickly through this because this can get a little clinical. A lot of women, or just people in general with DD, are going to have sensory processing differences, and that can really impact a lot of different things. So we might be hypersensitive, which might mean that we find like fluorescent lights really overwhelming, or we're really sensitive to loud noises, things like that. We might be hyposensitive, which means that our brain needs sort of more input. So that might be someone who really loves loud music and bright lights, things like that. Often it's not one or the other. It's some people are really sensitive in one way and much less sensitive in the other. I'm going to talk about a lot of accommodation strategies for this later on, but this can really impact like the room that you're talking to someone in and how you set up a scenario so that someone can focus. We might also have mixed processing, so someone might need to close their eyes so that they can really hear and process what you're saying, and so they're not getting overwhelmed by other information that they're getting. And generally, all of this can also lead really easily to sensory overload. Like I like to joke that if autistic people were in charge of the world, vacuums would all be silent. The world is not really designed for people with developmental disabilities. Our sensory preferences tend to be different from yours, and that means that we can get very overwhelmed by things that other people wouldn't necessarily notice. This can look different in different people. Sometimes that looks like someone just having a total meltdown and crying and not being able to go on. Sometimes that looks like someone who starts to have a hard time thinking or hearing or processing or talking. Sometimes it looks like someone who's moving around a lot trying to calm themselves down. What's important to understand is that sensory overload is really painful. It's not like a behavior that someone is doing at you. It's someone who's doing their best to deal with some really difficult stimuli. So the solution, which I'll talk about, is to look at the environment and things that you can change about the environment to make it more accessible. Next slide. Thank you. This is going to be really important when you're talking with clients and talking about statements and things like that. A lot of people are going to have language processing differences or speech differences. The first thing to understand is that language and speech are two totally different things. Your ability to process language and communicate using words of some kind is different from your ability to say those words with your mouth. And there's a disconnect between those two things for a lot of people with developmental disabilities, and especially for a lot of autistic people. So I'm going to talk about them separately. First, for language processing. Some people are going to be people who communicate much better through oral speech or through listening to people talk. Other people are going to communicate much better through writing. There's really no way to tell until you're with the person, but people will usually know what their preference is. I have staff members, for example, who I almost never actually talk to because we do everything through typing. For me, tragically, I have to speak like 70 hours a week as an executive director. And then there are obviously people on the flip side who might have trouble with literacy and so really rely more on oral speech. You also should be thinking about real-time versus sort of asynchronous communication. So a lot of the conversations that we have day-to-day in society are back and forth. You say what you need to say in the moment and then you move on. For a lot of people with developmental disabilities, cognitive disabilities, that's not going to work. We might be able to have a real-time conversation, but we might not be able to fully express ourselves or accurately express ourselves in that format. We might need more time to process what we were asked or what we were told, or to think about what we want to say and how we want to say it. So it's really important to make sure that people have other ways to communicate with you beyond just the back and forth in the moment. When we do staff meetings, for example, one of the common things we'll do is we'll ask if people have questions, and then we'll say, if you think of questions later, just send me an email or a message and we'll talk about it then. You want to try to build avenues like that whenever you're talking to someone. And then you also need to be able to see or respond to the email or the letter or whatever that they send you once they do. It doesn't work if you can't actually accommodate it, but if you do, you can get some really, really powerful information that way, and people can be much more confident about expressing themselves. A lot of people with developmental disabilities have a mismatch between our receptive language, the language we can understand, and the expressive language, or the language we can say. And that can go both ways. So for example, I can say pretty complicated things, but I often actually need people to use simpler language when they're talking to me. I also have lots of colleagues who can understand very complicated sentences and ideas, but who can only say or write very simple sentences. This is something you're going to learn just by getting to know the person, maybe getting to know people who are close to them who can tell you. But it's important to keep in mind that just because someone can say something complicated doesn't mean that they can necessarily understand that same sentence if someone else says it to them. I know that sounds weird if you're someone with a brain for whom these things are always matched up perfectly, but it's an important thing to keep in mind. Similarly, some of us are very literal and concrete, and so we might struggle with metaphors or abstract concepts, there we go, or figures of speech and things like that. Some of us really need to have the communication that we're having be like as here and now as possible, as tied to real things as possible. Some of us don't, but that can be another possibility. This often shows up a lot when we're using referentials in our sentences. So one habit that lawyers have that drives me crazy is asking me if I meant the former or the latter. I don't know what those mean. I mean, I've had it explained to me many, many times, but I can't remember the sentences that you just said to me and then remember what former versus latter means and then match them up and then tell you which one I meant. There's too many things I have to remember. It's too referential. This can also show up, people can get pronouns mixed up. People can get confused if you're using a sentence that has a lot of this and that and those kinds of words that are referring to previous information. So you want to think about how much you're loading up your speech with that and try to make it a little more concrete. Again, this isn't something that every person will have trouble with, but if the person does have trouble, they'll have a lot of trouble. In terms of speech, there are a few different things to keep in mind, and I'm going to take a drink of water very quickly. There are some people who don't speak verbally or who don't use verbal speech some of the time, and I'm going to talk about that later. But right now, one speech difference that a lot of autistic people rely on is called echolalia, and that just means echoing things that you've heard other people say. And there are two different ways that can work. You might work with someone who sort of immediately repeats things that you say or things that other people say. So that might be if you say, do you want juice or water? The person says water. And that's not because they actually want water, it's because it's the last thing you said, and they're only able to say the last thing you said. If you're working with someone like that, A, they'll probably have someone else in their life who can let you know that that's happening. But B, that just means you need to use other methods besides speech to ask questions like that. So you might want to use two different pictures and ask them to tick which picture they want, things like that that aren't so reliant on triggering that immediate echo. A lot of us use that early in life, and then we learn to use it in a more delayed fashion, and that's that second kind of echolalia, where someone might ask us a question, and we have a hard time putting words together in new ways, but we're really good at remembering things that people have said in the past. So if someone asks you, like, are you hurt? You might not be able to string together individual words to say, yes, I fell down and broke my leg. But you might be able to remember a TV show that you watched that had someone who was hurt on it, and you might be able to say the sentence that they said. Again, that can be hard to tell if that's happening, and it can be hard to then sort of retrace the steps and figure out what this person really means. It's something that you'll really start to get to know as you get to know the person and people in their life who can tell you, like, oh, I recognize that, that's from this, here's what was happening in that context. Again, people who are epilolic need access to other ways to communicate as well. And people who are epilolic can and do communicate. It's just going to take longer to figure out what they're saying. You have to sort of learn their personal lexicon. Some of us get very good at this very fast, but for people who it's more obvious and who you're more likely to recognize, just know that it'll take some time to get to learn what they mean. Some people will also repeat the same thing they've heard someone say over and over and over again. When they're doing that, that's usually more just like, it's just a repetitive thing to calm yourself down. So you want to learn for that person and ask someone in their life, like, what does this usually mean? Is it something I should pay attention to? Like, for example, I had a friend who, when she was upset, she would start saying that she wanted to brush her hair over and over and over again, even if her hair was fine. But what I learned was that if I recognized, oh, that means you're upset, let's go sit down and, hey, sure, we'll play with your hair. Once she was calming down and brushing her hair and feeling more regulated, she could start to tell me what was bothering her. So even if the speech seems really disconnected from what's happening, it's still worth learning, like, how that person is using it and whether or not you might be able to get some communication that way. A lot of people who have trouble putting words together will also use scripting, which is just preparing what they're going to say ahead of time. That can be a little confusing for other people because there are times when we can't really talk, and then there are times when we can talk in very fluent blocks of text. I'm one of those people. I have scripted this presentation. It's just important to keep in mind that might be something that's happening with your client. It's not necessarily something they're doing to be annoying. It's just how they're able to cope with situations where a large amount of text is needed. If that's the case, it can help to know ahead of time, like, what you're going to be asked to talk about. And it can also help to try to think about how to phrase this the right way. Sometimes you can activate a script without meaning to. And so if what the person is saying sounds a little off, it might be because they knew how to say that, but they didn't know how to specifically answer your question. The solution to all of this is just taking the time to get to know the person and to use multiple methods to communicate with them so they can indicate what they really meant. That's what time means there on that bullet point. And again, some people find it easier to put together big blocks of text as opposed to answer simple questions that require you to put together words in new ways. Other people are the opposite. Some people are much better at answering questions than they are at putting together long stories. You're going to have to figure out which way your client works. Some people are better in speech, some people are better in writing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. Okay, processing speed. I mean, this is the quintessential DD thing. People like to say that we're slow. Some of us do have slower processing speed. Some of us actually have a very fast processing speed. What's most likely to happen, though, is that you'll be working with someone who has an inconsistent or variable processing speed that will be very dependent on the context, on the things in the environment, on how comfortable they are with you, on how familiar they are with the topic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, this is really different from person to person. But this is another place where having asynchronous methods of communication can be really helpful to accommodate that kind of difference in processing speed. In general, and I think I talk about this later in the accommodation slide, but I'll say it now, you should be planning to spend more time with your clients with developmental disabilities than you might plan to spend with other clients just to accommodate differences in communication and processing speed. We also tend to have differences in our memory, and this is very different from person to person. Some of us are a lot like Dory, don't have great short-term memory. Some of us have a great long-term memory, but we can't remember what we're doing moment to moment. Some of us are really inconsistent. This is another area where salience becomes important. If you're a person who just processes the world differently, the things that are important to you about a memory might be really different from the things that are important to another person about the memory. So if you're trying to get someone to describe what happened, they might be describing details that to you seem irrelevant, or you can't even tell if they're talking about the memory at all. This is the kind of thing where, again, you have to get to know the person and how they best communicate and what they really value before you can really tell if that's what's happening. But as a general rule, try not to assume that things are irrelevant or disconnected. Try to assume that you just don't know what the connection is because you don't know enough about how that person thinks and what their experiences have been. Some of us have really good memories, but again, because of these inconsistencies and differences in salience, we might have a hard time accessing that memory. Or we might have good memories, but we might not be able to express it in a way that other people can understand. So these are just all things that you want to think about and bear in mind, and you want to try to avoid assuming that a difference in salience or communication or processing means that someone doesn't remember. You want to make sure that you're really checking that and controlling for that before you write that off. There are also a lot of people with disabilities, like I have to say this, people with developmental disabilities who have phenomenal memories, sometimes way too much memory, frankly, for one person. So memory can also be a real strength for some people. Differs person to person. Yes, thank you. Okay, last two characteristics. Most people with DD are going to have problems with executive functioning. Executive functioning is the part of your brain that keeps your brain on task. So this is stuff like attention span, prioritizing things, all of that. We're going to talk about some accommodations for that in general. Since you're not this person's boss, that shouldn't be a huge deal for you. But it's important to know that one of the things that comes with executive functioning difficulties is difficulty juggling competing demands. So, okay, that was fine, whatever the phone just said.
I think we can ignore that message from the phone. Carry on.
Okay. Yes, just making sure. So having problems with competing demands means that, for example, if you're sitting in a room, there's a lot of sensory stimulation, and you're having a conversation with a person, it can be hard to deal with all the different distracting factors there and pay attention to the conversation. And then if they're asking you to do something difficult, like remember something or talk about something emotional, or you're using a method of communication that isn't as easy for you, that gets even harder. So in general, when you're thinking about accommodating with people with DD, you want to try to be thinking about like how many different demands are on them in this situation, what demands can I take away, what things can I make easier, so they can use all of their brain for this most important thing. Finally, anxiety is really, really common in people with DD. There are some studies that say that like over 70% of autistic people, for example, have an anxiety disorder. That's a low number, I gotta tell you. It's very common. It's very understandable, especially when you think about what it's like to have a developmental disability and to see the world in really different ways and to just live in a world that's not designed for you. And I'm going to get into this on the next slides, but also most people with developmental disabilities have pretty significant trauma histories as well. So it's important to know that that person is pretty likely to have anxiety, and they're pretty likely to have had that before meeting you and before the events that led to them meeting you. And it will manifest differently in every person, but it's something to keep an eye on. Yeah, thank you. So I want to take a step back to the bigger picture and sort of talk about just at a really base level what it means to grow up as a woman with a developmental disability, because I think this is really not understood. At least 82% of women with intellectual and developmental disabilities are survivors of assault. I'm going to talk about why that happens on the next slide, but just know that it is very, very common. Harassment, bullying, abuse, and assault are commonplace for people with developmental disabilities. When we talk about this, people get obviously really concerned, and they talk about safety and they talk about ways to keep us safe. And often those solutions are described as building special places to put us and sort of isolate us from the rest of the world and only keep us as trusted people. But people with developmental disabilities know that safety isn't safe. The vast majority of these assaults come from people we're supposed to be able to trust, and often people who are explicitly charged with caregiving. We know that rates of abuse are higher in isolated settings and settings that are just for disabled people as opposed to when we're integrated into the community. That can be hard for some people to believe. There are over 40 years of research that I'm happy to share with you about that. Whenever we take a vulnerable community or a marginalized community and isolate us, the same thing happens every single time. And in addition, people with developmental disabilities have a lack of access to education and to accessible information. about harassment and assault, about our rights, and about the concept of bodily autonomy. That is just not information that is often provided to us. And often the information that's given to other people isn't accessible to us, isn't in language we can understand, it's too abstract, or it's just so disconnected from the reality we're living that we don't understand its relevance to us. And we also, and I think Leanne talked about this a lot on the last webinar, often have a lack of access to support after the fact as well. Thank you. So there are a lot of different sort of social and contextual factors that lead to this. I want to be really, really clear that people with developmental disabilities are not assaulted because of our disabilities. We are assaulted and harassed because we are not seen as real people. The same thing that causes that systemic discrimination causes the harassment and the abuse. We also aren't seen as reliable witnesses, and our abusers know that and take advantage of that. This is really not about us. It is about the way that people see us. There are also other things that happen to us as young people that shape this and make this reality more likely. A lot of young people with developmental disabilities, particularly autistic people, go through things like applied behavioral analysis, behavior therapy, or compliance training that essentially focuses on teaching you to get used to painful things, to people handling you and moving you around and making you do uncomfortable things and ignoring your protests, and on training you to be compliant. Like that is the stated goal. And it is very difficult for someone who's had that kind of training since they were 2 years old to identify that, well, for 10 years it was fine, and then this one thing happened, and that was different than the other 10 years. That time it wasn't okay, and I should definitely tell someone about it. People with developmental disabilities often go through social skills training. Some of that is helpful, but most commonly it reinforces those ideas. What people often take away from social skills training is that they don't understand the interactions they have with other people. If it's a misunderstanding or you feel unhappy or uncomfortable, it's probably your fault. It's probably because you didn't get something. And that if there's a disagreement with another person, that other person is going to be in the right. This again, like it's just grooming. It just sets people up to fail. I've talked about the disability community's understanding of needing support not being incompatible with being in charge of your life, but that's still not very well understood by broader society. And so the reality often is, if you're a person who relies on other people for a lot of support, you become kind of subject to their whims. You lose a lot of your autonomy. You shouldn't, but in reality you often do, because people aren't being very thoughtful about it. And that again can set up really dangerous conditions. And finally, a lot of people with developmental disabilities are funneled automatically into guardianship when they turn 18. And guardianship means that you lose a lot of your civil rights and often aren't legally seen as a person by yourself. There's a lot of abuse and neglect in guardianship, and it sets up a lot of these factors. So again, just to underscore, people with developmental disabilities are amazing. We have a lot of different skills. We're really unique, complicated people, but the world we grow up in is really awful. And the world we grow up in conditions us to expect and accept harassment. Next slide. Yay. But there are some things that you can do about that. One really key idea, and I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit, sorry, is this idea of presuming competence. Presuming competence is just this idea that with the right support, people with developmental disabilities are capable of a lot. It's this idea that everybody is a person, everybody thinks, everybody has feelings, everybody learns, everybody has a rich and complicated interiority. We might think differently, we might learn differently, but with the right support, we can learn. It doesn't mean that intellectual disability isn't real. Intellectual disability is 100% real. There is not like a secret genius inside every single person with an intellectual disability. But we don't actually know what intellectual disability is or what the limits are, because historically we've been wrong every single time. 40 years ago, parents of kids with Down syndrome were told that their child probably wouldn't live past age 20, they wouldn't learn to drive, they wouldn't learn to read, maybe they'd learn to walk, they wouldn't have a job, they might talk, they probably wouldn't, they'd never get married, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every single one of those things was wrong. We don't know what we don't know. It has turned out that people with developmental disabilities, when we're given the right support, can do just about everything, including like graduate college, get married, raise families, close institutions, like just truly incredible things. So we come back to this idea of presuming competence, which is all about providing supports to let the person be their full self. And it's also about this idea called the least dangerous assumption. And the least dangerous assumption basically just asks, what happens if you're wrong? So the example that we give is, let's think about a person who has really significant disabilities. They don't have a reliable way to communicate. You really have no way to know what they understand or what they're thinking or what's going on. So you can do two different things. You can assume that they don't really understand anything, and you can just sort of treat them like a toy and move along with your life and not really interact with them, and give them very limited opportunities and make a lot of decisions for them. Or you can assume that because you can't tell, you're going to assume that this person can understand everything, which means you're going to act exactly the way that you would want to be treated in that circumstance. You're going to assume that the person understands what they hear. You're going to assume that with the right, you'll find a way to communicate with them. You're going to treat them like a person. And those two paths have very different consequences if you are wrong. If you turn out to have been wrong and this person didn't really understand what you were saying, maybe they were bored. But if you were wrong and you treated someone like they weren't a person when they were, like you have really harmed someone. So you should always be asking yourself whenever you're making an assumption about someone's abilities or what they understand, like, what happens if I'm wrong? What's the least dangerous assumption I could mean here? How can I support this person? And that's really what presuming competence is about. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk about AAC. AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. This is just any way to communicate that's not speaking with your mouth. So handwriting, typing, pointing to letters to spell things out. Morse code, I'm not joking. I know some people with cerebral palsy who use Morse code to communicate because they can control like 1 foot, and that's enough. Sign language. There are a lot of devices that you might have encountered where people can type messages or push buttons that have pictures, and the device will compose a message and read it out. Handing pictures back and forth. At a minimum, most people can develop a consistent sign for yes and a consistent sign for no, and you can play 20 questions with them. There is some way for everyone to communicate as long as they can control one muscle on their body and like have preferences. If they have that, you can figure out a yes or no system and go from there. Hopefully that's not your job as a litigator. That's often the job of a trained professional, but you're going to encounter people who use all these different communication strategies, to be really clear there. If someone doesn't have a communication strategy, that needs to be like priority number 1. It's really hard to do anything else until you have that. The other thing to keep in mind is that everyone is an AAC user, including you. So if you've ever written an email, like you've used typing to communicate. If you've ever used an emoji in a Facebook message, you've used picture exchange to communicate. It's really just about normalizing all the different ways people communicate. AAC is often slower than speech. And people might end up using messages that are more compact because it takes more effort. So keep that in mind, but just like the ultimate takeaway is that speech isn't what's important, communication is important. There are lots of different ways to communicate. You're just going to learn what this person uses and go from there. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go through some common accommodation strategies real quick. You go to the, oh yeah, thank you. That was just my list of what they're going to be. Going to the next slide, thank you. So for the room, you start by thinking about sensory aspects of the room. A lot of people are really sensitive to fluorescent lights. A lot of autistic people can see the lights flicker as they go through their cycle, which is not something a lot of non-autistic people notice. Some people like bright lights. Some people really hate bright lights. About half of my office likes to work in total darkness. So just look at the lights, look at the sounds. A really fun game to play with non-autistic people is to ask them how many sounds they can hear the walls making. I can hear 4 different sounds from this wall right now. Like these might not be things you notice, but these are probably things your client notices, looking at the textures in the room, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and just trying to figure out what could be distracting, what should we maybe try to change. Similarly, familiarity can be really, really helpful, which I think is just a human trait. So it might be easier for you to go to the client. They might do better when they're in a place that they're familiar with, the people they're familiar with. Maybe they can bring an object that they're familiar with if you can't be in the places where they are, or they can't be with the people they already know. Just generally looking to build that familiarity. And I would really ask yourself when it seems like the environment is the problem, can we go somewhere else? Can we go on a walk? Like if this person likes to really move, maybe they'll communicate better if they're walking around. Just always trying to think outside the box. Next slide. I've talked a lot about time. You're probably going to need extra time, but that can look a few different ways. That might mean that you're doing lots of shorter sessions with a lot of breaks in between. It might just look like sessions that are longer overall, so the person has more time to process. It might look like waiting a lot in interactions with different people. For people who use AAC or people who are slow to communicate, like I would really challenge you to ask your question and then count to 15 in your head, and it's going to feel like the longest time you have ever waited, but that can be how long it takes people to be able to start answering. And that can be the difference between someone who you really can't like have much conversation with and someone who can actually give you a lot of information if you take the time. A lot of people also benefit from knowing like what's going to happen and in what order it's going to happen and how much time they have. So that might look like someone bringing a timer with them so they know, okay, I'm going to talk for 20 minutes and then I'm going to take a break, or having a schedule they can look at that says, I'm going to talk to Leslie, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to go home, just so people can keep track of what's happening and understand what to expect. Next slide. Movement is a huge accommodation strategy. A lot of people with sensory differences will move around a lot or move in repetitive ways as a way to regulate the sensory information we're getting. That's called stimming. Every human being on the planet stims. If you've ever like bounced your leg or chewed on a pencil or tapped your fingers, you are stimming. But in people with disabilities, it's more noticeable a lot of the time, or it looks different. It's important to let people do that. Let people move their bodies the way they need to. Sometimes the way we move our bodies can make us look disengaged or less trustworthy, just because of social biases that our society has. That's something to be aware of, but it's really important that the person is able to move their bodies the way they need to. That's an accommodation strategy they're trying to use on their own. Again, taking breaks can be really helpful. Someone get up and move during their break can be really important. The way people sit can be really important. Some people are going to do better like sitting under the table or sitting upside down in a chair or something like that. I would really encourage you not to care about that and to let people know that they can move around or sit however they want to and that you'll work with that. Some people are going to need to be close to an exit or to be able to see an exit. These are like positioning issues that you've probably thought about working with other clients. And then just in general, let people move around. Okay, I think I've just got a couple left, sorry. A lot of people, especially people with intellectual disabilities in particular, benefit from getting to know you and getting more familiarity with you and being able to build like a shared base of references and just having that context, and that really helps support their communication and their interaction. Some autistic people in particular will have like special interests that they like to talk about and think about a lot. If you can get to know those a little bit, you can often communicate better with the person. And then I talked a little bit about this, but just different ways to know what to expect. So a schedule, a picture schedule maybe if someone doesn't read very well. There are things called social stories where you can sort of say like, we'll go and we'll sit, the judge will come in, this will happen, and then this will happen, you'll say this, and then you'll go home. Just to really break down what to expect so the person can be prepared. Often having a developmental disability can kind of feel like anything can happen at any moment and everybody else knows what's going to happen, but you don't. So the more you can help the person figure out what to anticipate, the more successful they'll be. And then rehearsing those schedules and those plans. If you're going to give someone a schedule, please, for the love of God, stick to it to the extent that you can. But that will really help. Let's go to the next slide. I talked about a lot of this communication stuff already, so let's just go ahead and skip that. I did want to flag that a lot of people, including people who speak verbally, can't use phones, so it's important to be available in other ways. The last thing I wanted to talk about is bias. I've talked about this before, about how a lot of us have just these inbuilt assumptions about social communication and what it means when someone has certain body language or what have you, what paying attention looks like. It's important to really be aware of that and try to let go of that when you're working with people who have differences there. Dara's covered this, but you should learn what ableism is and you should look at your own disability bias. And then if you're working with people with developmental disabilities, you literally need to watch your tone. It's like people will start to talk to someone with Down syndrome or another intellectual disability and their voice will go up an octave. And just nothing communicates faster that you don't actually trust the person you're talking to than that. It's not something a lot of people are conscious of doing. I've watched people who consider themselves great disability disability allies do it all the time, completely unconsciously. So it's something to be really deliberate about, and just in general to always make sure that you're treating an adult like an adult. That's the whole thing, really. Okay. The last thing to know is that you can't always tell that you're working with someone with a developmental disability. A lot of us aren't diagnosed, or a lot of us seem to pass at first, and then when you get to know us more, you realize there's something going on. That's fine. Something we talk about a lot in disability rights is the curb cut effect. Curb cuts, the little part of the curb on a sidewalk that steps down to the road, are designed for wheelchair users, but lots of different people benefit from them, delivery people, people with crutches, etc. So just consider if any of these strategies would help folks that you don't necessarily think of as disabled. I think a lot of people benefit from moving around, for example. And I just want to say thank you. Women with DD have been through a lot, so thank you for helping us change that.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Julia. We are now going to turn it over to Mihal. This is Jennifer again. And if folks are watching the clock, I am going to give Mihal the floor. If folks have burning questions, send them to us through the chat function. Otherwise, I am going to let Mihal talk as long as she would like and maybe take us to the end of our time. Mihal.
Thank you so much to everyone involved in putting together this presentation. I'm going to be talking about what a lot of the information that you've received both in this presentation as well as in our prior presentation means as an attorney who is looking to represent someone who has been in some way sexually harassed, sexually assaulted. Now this can come up in a lot of different contexts. This can be talking about workplace situations, which is my area of focus. It can happen in educational settings. It can happen in caregiver settings and healthcare settings. You have a number of different potential causes of action to bring based on that, one of which to always keep in mind is just state level tort claims for assault and battery. Obviously, there is the criminal justice side of that, which is not my area of focus, but a lot of great guidance involving representing individuals with disabilities who are victims of crimes is out there, including put forward by the Department of Justice. And it's worth looking at those resources to hear how a lot of attorneys around the country handle these issues of representing individuals who have been subject to all kinds of violent crimes, including sexual violence. The first thing I want to say is that when someone is coming to you and seeking potential, representation, a sort of first step is to sort of think about what their legal needs are. They might have needs that are not legal needs. They might have healthcare-related needs, housing-related needs, a lot of things that aren't in your purview as an attorney to provide. But what are you able to provide for them, and to make them aware of that. Sometimes, people, first thought is this bad thing happened, and obviously I need a lawyer. And so thinking holistically about, are there potential other needs that you could just be upfront and be like, listen, I can't work on the housing issue with you, or, I would really recommend that you speak to a healthcare provider about these symptoms or these issues, but I'm not a healthcare provider. Those might be things that the person is not thinking about. And I think in terms of effective representation, being clear about what your purview is and potentially networking them to other resources is a great thing, but keeping clear about what your purview is, because you shouldn't assume that they understand that, and that legal services isn't an all-encompassing magic wand of services. One primary thing is there some sort of area of stabilizing their life that they are looking for? This could be to, have the harassment stop, if it's an employment context, they're thinking about, quitting their job because it's so bad, or is there some way they can be reassigned to a different position away from this harasser? Same thing if it's, a caregiver situation or some other way in which they're being subject to this person's abuse in an ongoing matter. The second one is, do they have privacy concerns? A lot of people are very concerned about what it means for their own personal information, both regarding any disability related issues that they may or may not be comfortable sharing in any kind of forum, as well as a sense of shame or embarrassment about a sexual harassment that occurred. And while I think in the era of the Me Too movement, there is an increasing recognition that these things happen to many people and it is not your fault, that doesn't mean for someone coming to you that isn't a real concern to address. And there's the justice element. People, are often coming to you because of a sense of this was wrong, it shouldn't have happened to me. There should be justice, and sometimes coupled with that is the desire to make sure that this doesn't happen to other people. I think for any kind of client relationship, but especially when dealing with an element of an individual with a disability seeking your assistance, there's a really important element of building trust and rapport with someone and understanding specifically what their needs are, the specific ways in which they like to talk about themselves, their world, how they identify, ways in which they may or may not be comfortable talking to you yet or in general about ways their disability impacts their life. They might have their strong language preferences in terms of terms and such. And so both so that you are using the terms that they want to use, as well as so that you are establishing that rapport of putting them first. It is their situation, their case. I'm really delving into how they want to talk about the situation. A number of individuals with disabilities are not comfortable talking about sex and sexual matters. We heard a lot from both Leanne and Julia about the ways in which our educational upbringing system really fails people to feel comfortable talking about that or even have the right terms and proper usage. And understanding that and understanding where language can be less specific or more general, ways in which the certain topics will be avoided. And also one thing that we see is that people will sometimes not share things up front, and it will become later on that someone will share more graphic things. This is something that can be specifically related to trauma, that it might take time before you get the full picture of what was going on or what might happen. In terms of other elements of sort of establishing a client relationship and assessing it, I don't make assumptions about what someone's disability is or isn't based on how they appear to you, how they communicate. Disabilities can be, both more and less severe than seen on the outside. They may impact people in a number of ways. Using Julia spoke a lot about using the methods of communication that feel comfortable to them as being really important. This can have a sort of two-sided thing. As attorneys, we're very often not comfortable talking to third parties, and in general, it is really important to be getting the client story and not the family member story or the interpreter story or some other third-party story, but also acknowledging and honoring the support people who are a real part of their life and how they manage their world and relationships with everyone. That being said, there are times where there might be some red flags. There are advocates who really caution attorneys in doing any kind of intake with individuals with disabilities, that they should take note when there's someone who seems to exert a little bit too much control, refuses to let them be alone in certain ways, and that person can either be an abuser or someone who wants to protect the abuser. Sometimes that can be the kind of paternalism of there are a lot of resources that individuals with disabilities rely on for a wide range of things in terms of activities of daily living, housing support, healthcare, et cetera. And, there are people in the advocacy community who really talk about how certain caregivers, quote unquote, well-intentioned mean that they're afraid of shaking those boats, severing those ties, et cetera. For the litigation process, and I'll say as a sort of big picture, in talking about these issues, sometimes we're talking about individuals with disabilities who are subject to sexual harassment for all the reasons we've discussed. They are seen as easier vulnerable targets. They are isolated. They are people who are lower down on the food chain. They are people who are less likely to report because they are afraid of losing things like employment or healthcare access to a caregiver. But the other side that comes up a lot in practice is that sexual assault itself can cause people to have diagnosed disabilities. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety are all disabilities that are covered by the amendments to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And someone, whether that sexual harassment stemmed from a workplace scenario or not, or whatever the source, that person can now find themselves in a position where they need accommodations where they didn't before, and can have a supervisor be not sympathetic and deny them their rights under either Title VII or the ADA. And we're going to talk about that scenario a little bit later on. So somebody contacts you. They want to speak with you. I would say, we discussed this, but the trust building element, the learning how they want to communicate is important. Trusting that they can be their own witness is really valuable. Sometimes there's a lot of skepticism that, who's going to believe this person for a number of reasons. And I think a really important thing to keep in mind is that individuals with disabilities are witnesses in many cases in all kinds of proceedings all around the country. They can testify for themselves. In fact, if you're talking about certain kind of communication issues, there are often specific instructions the judge will give the jury. For example, the National Association for the Deaf has specific recommended, and it's been adopted in a number of forums, proposed instructions reminding the jury that they can only how to, listen appropriately to the interpreter, or the interpreter is not the witness. They are supposed to credit, what the person is saying. They're not supposed to in any way discount the person's testimony because they communicate via a sign language interpreter. These are important things. In fact, there is a training or a manual put out by the Department of Justice talking about the problems arising in effectively litigating or prosecuting cases where investigators just assume that individuals with disabilities wouldn't be able to effectively participate, and you have a situation where you're not, speaking to the witnesses you should and gathering the information that you should. For any phase of litigation, I think that it is important to talk about, with any client, important to talk about what is to be expected, the system, how it works. In particular, if someone is dealing with a disability, the best way I found to make sure that you're appropriately accommodating them is to explain the steps going on in detail, to talk with them about what that will look like for them and what would assist them in that process. So things that might seem obvious to you about, say, what mediation is, or what it means to draft an affidavit for an EEOC charge, or meet with an investigator, or have a deposition taken, testify. are things to really be broken down so you don't have any unforeseen issues where someone's saying, well, here are the barriers I have, and also to prepare the other side. I think that anyone who litigates cases know that the litigation process and discovery can be a messy and sticky battle, and is one in which parties are fighting over all kinds of things, and making sure that you understand what your client might need to go through that process, especially at the deposition phase, is really important. And a general tactic I know that a lot of my colleagues in the Disability Rights Bar Association have is, at the end of the day, let's take the perspective that they will be worse off if they are seen as being unreasonable or unkind to an individual with a disability when it wouldn't have taken that much. So, for example, if you're dealing, say, with a deposition, explaining in detail what the process is, thinking about what kind of communication issues will be involved in that, what kinds of accommodations might help them be able to testify. Every jurisdiction is different. In general, there is a lot of bad case law out there about the format of depositions. For example, people are insisting to use the portion of the civil rules of federal civil procedure that allow a party to take depositions via written questions. And the court says, well, that is, their prerogative. They can do it via verbal questions. And frankly, I understand that in the sense that I would not put up with it if someone informed me that they were going to only allow me to take a harasser's deposition via advanced written question. But thinking about instantaneous communication that way, explaining how it works, explaining how it won't compromise the other side's right to take the discovery that's needed under federal civil procedure, can get the parties to a reasonable statement. Videoing depositions is really valuable to the extent there's going to be any dispute about someone not cooperating or giving an answer that might have seemed vague, or answering a different question, or some of the verbal communication issues that Julia brought up. Having those videos is valuable, and in fact, some people will video like a number of parties in the room, the person asking the question, the person being deposed. One best practice people use when dealing with ASL interpreters is having video cameras on the interpreter as well as the witness, to make sure that, to the extent that there's any question about communication, you have that visual documentation of what the question was, which the court reporter is not taking down, the sign. So that video is really valuable. A final thing that comes up a lot is issues about confidentiality or medical issues. Sometimes there can be someone with a disability who is bringing a case, and the issue is not everything about their disability, and there can be an overbroad reach into medical information about them. It's only the medical issues that you put at issue in your case that are subject to discovery. So if you're saying a condition worsened, et cetera, but if just because someone is a person with a disability engaging in civil litigation doesn't mean there's a broad door open to everything about their medical life and history. Regarding issues of let me stop there. I'm going to move to the issue of people who need accommodations as a result of developing, things like PTSD, anxiety, et cetera, as a result of sexual harassment. So the disability itself is covered in terms of accommodations, regardless of the source of the harassment. The harasser doesn't have to be someone in the workplace. It can be in any context. There is a number of cases that that I've seen where that becomes a sort of secondary issue to harassment in the workplace. If someone was harassed, and then like part of what they seek as help is not just they be removed from the harasser, but now they have medical appointments, or they have other accommodation needs that are not being met, and depending on the employer's perspective on the credibility of this claim, the harasser, and it's usually their incredible value to the organization compared to you know, your client who they just kind of wish would go away and stop shaking the boat, there can be uphill battles involving getting accommodations and getting those put in place. Sometimes that itself can be a form of retaliation, which is something to think about in terms of pleading your case. Now, when it comes to well, let's put another point to keep in mind about bringing cases that involve these intersection issues. The individuals with a outside of work related sexual harassment case that is treated worse than other, you know, similar requests for, say, medical leave or accommodations, or even just, you know, scheduling changes, et cetera, can involve, you know, negative views of individuals with disabilities, can involve negative sex stereotyping involving people who are subject to sexual harassment, and that should be something you consider in pleading your case. There are a couple of court cases that have addressed that. Notably, the Fourth Circuit in a case, Mosby Grant versus the City of Hagerstown, was the court to, you know, first say that demeaning comments about people who are survivors of sexual assault can be a hostile work environment on the basis of sex. It was something advocates were saying for a long time, that this is a gender-based perspective, and there's a circuit court that has noticed that. The EEOC guidance talks about disfavorable views of people who are survivors of sexual violence as being a disparate treatment angle to look at. And as there's also even a favorable case in the Fifth Circuit, Road versus KO Steel casing. Finally, there are state laws that provide protection for individuals who engage in the reporting of crimes or involved in prosecuting a crime. And so even if it's someone who was sexually harassed and is pursuing that in some other forum, where I work, for example, in Maryland, if someone is doing something through the criminal justice system to address that kind of sexual assault, an employer can't take actions against them, or the same as they couldn't for any kind of violent crime or crimes as part of a public policy measure to make sure that people aren't losing their jobs because they're assisting law enforcement. There are a lot of ways to be mindful of how to effectively represent your client. I'd say the key thing to think about is that, number one, individuals with disabilities are credible witnesses whose stories should be believed, and people who are interested in addressing the rampant issues of sexual assault in our society should think about representing them and doing what prosecutors around the country do, which is take their story seriously and take their accounts seriously. Not that this always happens in practice, but it's the official policy that people aren't disqualified from testifying. And two, in a very case-specific way, talk to your client about accommodations needed for the legal process, which means really detailing what it's going to entail, what this might look like, and then finally making sure that these things are followed through, so that to the extent that there is any difficulties created by the other side in terms of how you want to present your case and accommodate your client through the legal process, it looks like you are trying your best to make reasonable attempts to just have a normal civil proceeding move forward, because it's much better if they look like, the other side looks like they are refusing to make reasonable accommodations for an individual with a disability. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer for any questions that we've gotten now.
Yeah, so sorry, this is my event. So we just have people requesting the citations for the cases that you mentioned for the cases.
Sure.
And the other, and if you have other cases as well.
Sure. So the Fourth Circuit case recognizing that making comments about sexual harassment, or I think it's domestic violence survivors in a demeaning way, was Mosby Grant versus the City of Hagerstown. It was 630 F 3rd 326, and that's a Fourth Circuit case from 2010. And the Fifth Circuit case I mentioned is a case called Rohde, R-O-H-D-E, versus K.O. Steel Casings, and it's 649 F 2nd 317. And it recognizes a different about how employer treats people who are or not involved in any sort of sexual harassment allegations. And the EEOC guidance is officially called Application of Title VII and the ADA to applicants or employees who experience domestic violence or dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And it's available on the EEOC website.
Okay, this is Jennifer Mondino again. I want to say thank you to Dara, Julia, and Michal for these fantastic presentations today, and also for all of their great advocacy work on behalf of persons with disabilities. If people are interested in sharing or checking out this webinar again, a recording of the webinar and a copy of the slides and maybe some of the materials that the presenters have mentioned today are going to be posted on the National Women's Law Center website shortly. So take note of that, and thank you everyone for tuning in today.